All right, so we're going to pick up here with part two. So before we start looking at the specifics of our epidermis, let's look here at this little schematic that is showing the various layers of our epidermis. So remember, starting most superficial and going toward the dermis or more deep, we have stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. Now, a nice mnemonic to remember the order from superficial to deep is come, let's get sunburned. Okay, that's the mnemonic that I use to remember it in school. I think it's helpful. It's one that I still use. If that helps you, use it. If it doesn't, then forget that I said it. So again, stratum corneum, come, lucidum, let's, granulosum, get, spinosum, sun, and basal, burn. So come, let's get sunburned. And then within each of these different layers, we'll look and see some different characteristics of each, different cells that we find in each. And again, this lucidum, this kind of clear lucid layer here, right beneath the corneum, this is the one that we'll see is only present in thick skin. And so we're going to start at the most deep layer. Okay, so when we look at this, we're going to start way down here at this basal layer. So our basal layer is the deepest of our epidermal layers. It's going to have roughly 5 layers, and these are the cells that are most mitotically active. Okay, so where we have actively dividing and replicating cells via mitosis that are pushing their way from the bottom, so from the stratum basal, working their way up. And if you think about our mnemonic, the stratum spinosum is the next most superficial layer. And so these cells from the stratum basal that are dividing are pushing their way up into the stratum spinosum. Our stratum basal is attached via different connective tissue, and they're sitting on top of this structure called the basement membrane. And then just beneath this basement membrane, we have our dermal layer. Now, within our stratum basal, and kind of on the bottom surface of our stratum basal, at this junction between the epidermis and dermis, we have some different cells. So we have keratinocytes, we have melanocytes, and we have Merkel cells. So keratinocytes, these are going to be cells that are, they're the actual cells of our epidermis. And so if you remember what we called our epidermis, it was a stratified squamous epithelium, but it was keratinized. And so keratin is a protein that is produced via these keratinocytes. This keratin, we also said that sometimes it's called being cornified or keratinized, but this keratin protein provides our skin with a somewhat of a rigidity and hardness, as well as the waterproof uh, nature and characteristic of our skin. So now this has, um, it primarily deals with preventing water from leaving the skin, so from coming out, than it does from things coming in. Okay, so we have water within our cells, within our skin. We want to prevent that from just evaporating and from leaving. And so this keratin that is that is found within these different cells helps to do that. And as our cells work their way up, and so if we go back to this picture here, as these cells work their way up, you see these up here, they don't have a nucleus. So these are actually going to be dead cells, and they're almost completely full of this keratin protein within these keratinocytes. Whenever you look at it histologically, you will see these little strands, these little fibrous strands. All of those are keratin. Okay. Now, our second cell type is our melanocytes. Our melanocytes, as their name suggests, are melanin. So the melano is referring to melanin, and then the cytes refers to cells. So these are cells that produce the pigment melanin. And so we find melanin in all different skin types. Different types of skin will have different amounts of melanin in them. It is melanin that provides somewhat of a protection against ultraviolet rays from the sun. We can see it in darker skin. There is a greater abundance of melanin, and then in lighter skin there is less. In people who have freckles, that is an area of skin with a greater concentration of melanocytes that is producing more melanin, and so you see localized areas that contain a darker pigment. Okay? And again, you find these in our stratum basal, and then we have Merkel cells. Merkel cells are going to be a type of mechanoreceptor, and so they're sensing mechanical stimuli or touch from our environment. They um, will sense the kind of onset of touch at different points. Sometimes they're also called tactile cells, so Merkel cells, tactile cells, sometimes called Merkel's discs. Um, and again, they're serving as a cutaneous mechanoreceptor that is sensing pressure and touch that is occurring from our external environment. And so if we look here, we have our stratum basal here at the very bottom. Here you can see a melanocyte as it exists within the stratum basal, and it kind of works its way up. It will produce melanin in little vesicles that will then work their way up throughout the skin. And then here you can see histologically this darker layer here. So all this kind of lighter pink, hopefully if you see my arrow or my cursor, all this pink is part of the dermis. And so this layer here that is found just superficial to the dermis, this is all of our stratum basal. And so you can follow it around, and we'll talk about what these little ridges are here in a little bit. So our next one, just superficial to our stratum basal, is our stratum spinosum. It contains roughly 10 or so layer of cells, so the same type of cells we talked about before, the keratinocytes. And again, as they continue to divide, they will be pushed upward into the stratum granulosum. And in this layer, we have a cell type called a Langerhans cell, sometimes called a dendritic cell. Now, these participate in immune reactions, and what they do is they're a type of antigen presenting cell. And so what this means is that if we have a foreign antigen, a foreign bacteria, some type of foreign particle within our body, these cells will take them up via phagocytosis. So it is a phagocyte. It will take it up, it will package it into a vesicle, it will break it down via lysosomal activity and present a part of it on its surface. So it is an antigen presenting cell. So it presents part of it to other cells in our immune system that can then come and react with it to take care of that particular cell and prevent it, or rather be able to recognize it if it enters in the future. And so these were Langerhans cell. That doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what it is. Paul Langerhans in the late 1800s was the first one to actually identify these cells, so hence the name Langerhans. They're also called dendritic cells because on their surface they look like they have little dendrites, dendrites being a part of our nervous system, a part of our neurons. And so I'll show you a picture here in just a second. But here's our stratum spinosum here. You can see more layers than our stratum basal. And in here we have our dendritic cell. Here's going to be our stratum spinosum histologically, running right here, just superficial to our stratum basal. And here on the right here, you can see a picture of our dendritic cells, or our Langerhans cells. And then here on the left, you can see a picture of a kind of a typical neuron. So here you can see these dendrites coming out. That is what these are supposed to resemble. Now, they're not dendrites. They're little kind of cytoplasmic extensions that don't function in the same way as dendrites do with neurons. But they kind of resemble that appearance, so hence their name, dendritic cells. But again, remember, they are phagocytic. They participate in the immune system, and they will present antigens to other immune cells. Again, they're found in our stratum spinosum. So our next layer is going to be our stratum granulosum. It will contain roughly 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes, and it's at this point that our cells kind of begin to die, and they're beginning to lose their organelles. So the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, things like that. Within these cells, they begin to disappear. They contain our keratin protein, again, as well as granules that give them a somewhat kind of grainy appearance, and hence their name, granulosum, so somewhat grainy appearance. And depending on if we're talking about thin skin or thick skin, these cells will then be pushed up into the stratum lucidum if we're talking about thick skin, because they'll have this extra layer. If we're talking about thin skin, the stratum granulosum cells will be pushed up into the stratum corneum, so our most superficial. So again, depending on what skin you're talking about, thin or thick, the stratum granulosum will transition into the stratum lucidum or the stratum corneum, depending on what you're talking about. So here you can see our granulosum. Can't really tell that these have the granules in this picture, nor can you really tell it over here, but in certain micrographs and certain histological pictures, you'd be able to see a more grainy appearance. Now, here is our stratum lucum. So this is what is going to be found only in thick skin. So places like our palms of our hands, the digits of our fingers and toes, as well as our the soles of our feet. So it's located between the granulosum that we just talked about and the corneum that we'll talk about next. It contains a clear protein called elidin that gives it this transparent or lucid. Anything meaning lucid is clear, transparent, so hence the name LUCIDUM. And these are dead with no organelles here. And so if you look here at this representation here, you can see it's very clear. You see no nuclei within the cell, or if you do, it's beginning to kind of disappear and fade out as it's dying. And then here on a histological picture, you can see this kind of clear layer here as you follow it down. It's much more clear and lighter in color than the surrounding stratum corneum, especially the stratum granulosum here. It's much lighter in appearance. And so that's what this is going to be, so stratum lucidum. So if you were to look at this picture here on the right, and you see this term, you see stratum lucidum, and it's this clear appearance, you would know that you're looking at what type of skin, thick or thin. Well, we know that this is stratum lucidum. It's found only in thick skin, and so this has to be an example of thick skin, and then be able to recognize and be able to determine, okay, where in our body may this have come from? Well, maybe it came from our soles of our feet or palms of our hand or our digits. Okay, and so I would be able to determine what type of skin you're looking at, as well as where you may be able to find that skin in the body. Now, our last epidermal layer that we'll talk about is our stratum corneum. So our stratum corneum is the one that is in contact with our environment. So when we look at the number of layers, 15 to 30, this kind of makes intuitive sense. If we're going to be in contact with our environment, it makes sense to have a thicker layer of cells to be able to protect us from our external environment for mechanical abrasions, for cuts, for anything like that. If we have a thicker buildup, a thicker layer, in theory we would be more protected. Cells from our stratum lucidum and granulosum, depending on if we're talking about thin or thick, will be pushed up into this layer, and this layer of cells is going to be completely void of organelles. It's going to be dead. They'll be packed with keratin, and they will be replaced about once a month. Okay, so constantly, even right now as you're watching this video, as I'm talking, some of our stratum corneum cells are being shed and they're falling off, and this will be completely replaced about every 4 weeks. Okay, and again, where are those new cells originating? Well, they're originating way down in our stratum basal, and they're being pushed upward as they divide. Now, if our stratum corneum in certain areas, if we are undergoing constant stress and repeated mechanical activity, it makes sense that we would increase mitosis, increase the division of cells kind of at this region, and send more cells to here to compensate for this increased mechanical stress. And whenever that happens, we get something known as a callus. And so you've likely heard of a callus, you may even have one, and I'll show you a picture of a good example of one here in just a second. And so here's our stratum corneum. You can see there are lots of cells packed on top of each other, very thick layer. You see no nucleus, no organelles like you'd be able to down here. And then here you can see it here. No real no appearance of nuclei. And again, in this picture here, we're looking at granulosum, and we go immediately to stratum corneum. We do not see stratum lucidum, so we know that this tissue here has to be taken from an area of thin skin. So where would you find thin skin? Well, you would find it everywhere but the palms of our hands, soles of our feet, and our digits. Okay. Here's a picture of a professional golfer, and you can see all throughout his hands, there are these large calluses. You can see them all throughout. And so it makes sense in a profession such as golfing, when you are gripping a golf club, when you are holding it, when it is twisting in your hand constantly, that is some type of mechanical stress, some type of force that is being applied to your stratum corneum out here. And so it makes sense that this area is going to be built up with a thicker layer of keratinocytes here, as opposed to other areas of his hand that would not be experiencing as much stress. So you can see way out here on the tip of his fingers, not as much stress going on, but here midline, there would be more stress going on here. So we will stop there with part 2, and we'll pick up in the next video with part 3.